I'll get us started here. First of all, thank you and welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, which is part of a collaborative series between the Midwest Cover Crops Council and the Iowa Learning Farms. And we're happy to hear about cover crops in challenging conditions from Eileen Kladivko and Nathan Johanning. And you can enter your questions in the chat throughout, and we'll answer those at the end of Eileen and Nathan's presentation. And then we have a few more details for you after that. So we'll save those questions for the end, but again, enter those in the chat and we'll keep up with those throughout. So now I will hand the virtual microphone over to Eileen and you can kick it off.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. Nathan and I are very happy to be here today to share some thoughts that we have about using cover crops in challenging conditions. And really, we're going to look at that from the two sides. One is if you're trying to establish and grow cover crops in conditions that would be less than ideal for the cover crops. So that's one way of looking at it. And the other one is if you have challenging agronomic conditions and you're hoping to use cover crops to help you with those. So we're going to do just a little bit of both sides of that question. So basically, we know that cover crops can help us solve certain agronomic or soil and crop management problems that we might have or challenges, but they also need some help. They're not miracle workers. They can't solve really bad conditions all on their own. So we do know that some conditions really make it challenging to get cover crops established, or for them to grow enough that it makes it worth your while to plant them. So before we get into those challenges, let's just very briefly recap some of the potential benefits that cover crops might offer you and discuss some of those challenges. So I always encourage people when they're thinking about cover crops, whether they've done it before or not, is to really think hard about why are you planting a cover crop? Not just that, it's of course a good thing, but be a little more specific. What is the main purpose that you're planting cover crop on a particular field? And what are the resource concerns, to use NRCS lingo, the resource concerns or the particular problems that you're trying to address? Because that main purpose is going to affect, first of all, which cover crop you select or which cover crops you select, and then secondly, how you manage those particular cover crops. I like to show this diagram from the SARE program, the Swiss Army knife, talking about cover crop benefits and the many different benefits that there are. And no one cover crop is actually, unlike the Swiss Army knife, there's no one cover crop that's going to give you all of those benefits, right? But you need to think about, okay, what is your main purpose? Do you want to increase yields? Of course, everybody does. Do you want to build soil organic matter, improve rainfall infiltration, control weeds, prevent erosion, have better economic returns? What are the particular benefits that you're looking for, the 2 or 3 maybe major benefits that you're looking for? And then that will help you select the particular cover crop that you want to try to implement and integrate into your system. When we're selecting cover crops, of course, there are many different ones. I would say dozens, not hundreds, but probably dozens. But there are 3 main categories of cover crops that we usually think about, and that's already our first selection when we're thinking about what benefits are we looking for. So the grasses are probably the most common cover crop that we use throughout the world, but certainly in the Midwest. So whether that's cereal rye or oats or annual ryegrass or one of the other winter cereals, the grasses are usually chosen because for their fibrous roots. So they have fibrous roots that essentially pull particles together, help build soil aggregates, and help improve that aggregate stability and infiltration into the soil, as well as scavenge nutrients, particularly nitrogen. So grasses are used a lot. The second category that we think about are the brassicas, such as this daikon radish here. These can be very effective in breaking up shallow compaction and to some extent subsoil compaction because of their deep root. They're also excellent nutrient scavengers, but they're not very good if what you're trying to do is build soil aggregation near their topsoil. And in the third category, of course, are the legumes, like the crimson clover here as an example. And these also have very good roots for building soil aggregation. And of course, we choose them when we want to fix atmospheric nitrogen to put back into the soil. So that's kind of our first cut when we're deciding what kind of cover crop might we want to implement. All right, so now let's get into what the title of our presentation today is, related to challenges. So there are many challenges both to establishing cover crops as well as soil challenges that cover crops might help alleviate. The four we're going to talk about briefly today include naturally poorly drained soils, high water table soils, low fertility soils, or soils that are in a condition of low fertility right now, prevent planting, and then compaction. And I know the Wednesday seminar dealt a lot with compaction. There's also other challenges like the timing of getting cover crops established, later in the season, or soil conditions that are too wet or dry or cold or hot, or other things like that. But we're going to deal with these first four very briefly today. So naturally poorly drained soils, of course, are quite a challenge for our cash crop production. We definitely don't like to see our cash crop being flooded out under conditions as you can see here. And when I'm talking about poorly drained soils, I'm talking about the drainage class, the natural drainage class. So high water table soils that have some layer down below the soil, not a plow pan. I'm talking about a fragipan, a clay pan, a dense glacial till, something that holds the water up and that keeps crop production from being optimal because of that condition. So what do we do in the Midwest and other places in the world as well? We install subsurface tile drainage, and that's quite often the first step we need in order to make some of our most productive Midwest soils productive. Okay, so it's a first step to improving cash crop production. But they also impact cover crops. So this is from a drainage project that I've had in southeastern Indiana for many years. And in this particular year, we were in a corn soybean rotation. We were going into soybeans. It had been wet. Finally, about mid-May, it started to be such that we could go out and spray and terminate our cereal rye cover crop. So this was the day before we were going to terminate and plant. And you can see that the upper left photo here, we have a very good growth of cereal rye cover crop. And when we harvested that, we had harvested a sample, we had about 3,100 pounds of above ground biomass per acre. So very good cover crop growth. The same field where it did not have tile drainage, you can see much less growth. You can see that we had a good stand, right? It's not that we're missing patches of plants. We had a good stand, but the plants are just puny, right? They're just not growing very well because they don't like that wet feet. And that had less than a fourth of the amount of biomass that we had where we had good drainage. So if you're going to the trouble to plant cover crops, of course, you want them to grow. And drainage is going to be an essential, it's basically essential. We've known this kind of thing for a long time in different ways. This is one way that the Midwest Cover Crops Council has categorized that in our decision tool. If you're not familiar with our decision tool, check it out on our website. But in our decision tool, you put in your county and your state. And along the left side here, you have the cover crops. And then along the top, you have dates of the year. And the green bars tell you when that cover crop can be reliably established in your county. And you can see here that most of our cover crops have this red caution sign here. And their establishment dates are all grayed out, which basically means don't plant these because they're not going to do very well under the conditions that I specified. A naturally poorly drained soil with no tile, okay? Not going to work. However, once you put tile into that naturally poorly drained soil, almost all of those cover crops basically came back, okay? So we know that we can get them established as long as we have adequate drainage. So the bottom line of that is that drainage pays. Drainage enables other conservation practices to work better, not just cover crops. But if you have a poorly drained soil and you want to do no-till or you want to do cover crops, the cover crop is not going to solve the naturally poor drainage. If you want good cover crop growth, well, and if you want good cash crop growth, the first thing to do is take care of that drainage problem. So the bottom line statement of that really is adequate drainage is a necessary first step for improving cash crop yields as well as cover crop yields and soil health, and getting some of those other practices to actually be effective for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan for a while, and he's going to talk about our next challenge.
All right, so thank you. I appreciate that kind of introduction on that topic. And so I'm going to transition now to talk about soil fertility and some of the situations, especially when we're having cover crops in low soil fertility. All right, you can go ahead and advance. So with low soil fertility, remember that cover crops can be an integral tool with the improvement of fields in low soil fertility, but they cannot work miracles on their own. Don't expect, if you have say a field with truly poor fertility across the board, just adding a cover crop is not going, it's not going to grow a jungle of growth just because it's a cover crop if you're struggling to grow corn and soybeans there. So in the bottom line, certainly you want a couple things for optimal crop production agronomics. You want to couple this with soil testing and the addition of amendments to truly make improvements. But as we'll talk, cover crops can be a great tool to work in conjunction with that. In that process, certainly I feel that the pH is your most, if nothing else you can correct, that's your most important initial correction to make because of the influence pH has on all of your other nutrients and their availability. So, but then follow that by your main macronutrients, your phosphorus and potassium, and also nitrogen supply for the crop. So cover crops' role in this is they do a lot of work for helping to cycle nutrients and then hold them within that system. And this can be really helpful in fertility means whenever you're talking about the addition of organic amendments or manure, and you're wanting to put those out and you're wanting to get them incorporated into that soil system. And then if you have fall applications of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, especially the first thing that always comes to mind is if you would be putting out fall P and K and you're using DAP and you have a little extra nitrogen, but there isn't really anything out there to use it, a cover crop can subtly make good use of that, maybe 20 to 30 pounds of extra in and keep it in your soil and in your system. You can get some benefit from it rather than having it sit there being prone to leaching. All right. So within low fertility, there are some things to consider as far as their species selection. So generally under poor nutrient fertility, when those situations, a lot of our grass species, I think of cereal rye and sorghum sudan as being the respective winter and summer kind of champions in low soil fertility, but really most all of the grasses do fairly well at tolerating low nutrient fertility. Some others I would highlight would be things like buckwheat, radish, and sun hemp as well. Now note with all these, especially in radish can be a great tool, but with any of these, they're not going to grow a lot whenever they're, under their stressed conditions from having lack of nutrients. Low pH annual ryegrass is a great one. Just its nature and development, it handles low pH soils better than some. If you have any saline soil, sodium issues, winter barley is probably one of the noted for the best tolerance of saline soils and sodium. But also sunflower, rapeseed, oats, and cereal rye have some tolerance of that as well. And with any of these, and these are just kind of highlights, it's not to say that some other species wouldn't work, but these are some things to kind of focus on. Consider the higher end of your seeding rates ranges for a given species, and of course balancing that if you have a mix and balancing your seeding rates. But remember that with you're not going to have that same performance off of one plant. No different. Eileen's image with the drainage shows the same thing. So we had to stand, but it wouldn't hurt to plant them a little thicker, because under low fertility, a single plant isn't going to grow as much biomass as what it would under more average to optimal fertility. So and that doesn't mean going crazy with seeding rates, but just means to be conscious of that. All right. So here's just the next few slides are just a few examples of some scenarios and research and some comparison to show differences in fertility and how that can influence things. So this is an example from a research trial we had where we had some residual nitrogen issues different between year to year. So you can see from this is 60 pounds plant drilled of cereal rye. This is in 2 different seasons, but you can see the same rate, same is planted the first week of October, both times. And we initially had 2,300 pounds of biomass in 2023. And then on the slide on the right, you see a 24, spring of 2024, same rate scenario. We had over 8,000 pounds of biomass. Next. So one thing that we took away from that in these trials, although not in the same year, but whenever we looked back, we also had the analysis of the total N in the biomass. And so we noted, and this fell back to our observations from the field, is that in the first year, 2023, with the lower biomass, we had a very low amount of nitrogen. There wasn't much nitrogen residual left in that field that crop was able to take up. And in that case, that was due to the corn crop of 2022, which lingered and due to the fall conditions really just utilized very well all the nitrogen in the soil, versus the next season, whenever we came out, there's a lot more residual nitrogen. So when we did the analysis of the biomass, we had 1.3, almost 1.4% nitrogen in the biomass. So that's just an indication where we're capturing the fact that residual nitrogen makes a big difference in how much our cover crops grow. Next. So this is another scenario where that's basically similar things in topic. So this was a field that I'd done some research in and around, and we had planted the fill part of this field into cereal rye. And I happened to have my drone up and was taking some imagery in April of that year. And after looking at it, I noticed some really interesting patterns to it. Next. So whenever you look at this at first from the ground, you could note that there were, there's some patches are really growthy, and then you can see, especially like in the center of that picture, some areas you can see bare ground, whereas other stuff was very vigorous in this cereal rye. So, and some of you maybe can figure this out, but looking for this, but this was due to actually the anhydrous application in the corn the year prior. So this was taken in April of 2023, but it was the effects from nitrogen that was applied in April of 22. We're not always blessed with square fields, so you can see where they set down the toolbar and doubled up on nitrogen quite clearly. Those little triangles I have highlighted, you can see the headlands and things on some of these small irregular fields. You can see it even up at the top of the picture. There's a little triangle you can see from overlap, and there's probably others, but they're very distinct. And this was nitrogen applied a year prior, and the rye picked it up extremely well. So, but what that shows again is just a really good illustration reminding us that residual nitrogen and nutrients do play a big role in our growth. But the flip side is also that our cover crops, if we didn't have a cover crop here, we would just have all that residual nitrogen just left to lay idle. And so now we're able to actually capture and utilize that, keep it in our soil system, and continuing on. Next. So that was a little on just some of the nutrient side. The biggest takeaway on the nutrients is just that, remember, our cover crops aren't going to instantly create new nutrients and change it, but we can use them as that tool along with it. Now, the next situation we're talking about is prevent plant. So this is a case where we have an agronomic challenge in our cropping system, and this is where cover crops can be a helpful tool in that situation where we can't get a cash crop planted in a timely fashion like we'd like. So what are they doing for us in this? Well, the same things that cover crops, always do, but why do we especially want them? They can scavenge and hold applied nutrients. How often do we have a prevent plant situation where we already have nutrients applied and where we have that investment made? What do we want to make of it? Well, cover crops can help to hold it. You can get biomass and biomass growth that can be very substantial for the health of the soil and the biology, and make use of that. Otherwise, if you don't, more than likely, either the weeds are probably going to take it up and utilize it and not be something desirable. Weed suppression is the other thing, as I mentioned, weeds. The alternatives, if you don't have anything in the field, the alternatives would be mowing, repeated spraying or tillage. All of which also cost money, and in some cases, especially for the last repeated tillage, obviously have some negative implications to soil health as well. Mowing is okay, but you want to make sure whatever you do that you're preventing weeds from taking over, and worse yet, going to seed. From a weed management standpoint, the last thing you want on a prevent plant year is it to grow up in weeds, they go to seed, and then you've created a world of headaches for the future years. So the weed suppression is key, and a healthy cover crop, summer cover crop, can really do a lot for that. And if you had compared to a fallow situation with no green material, by having a cover crop there, you're keeping that soil biology active. You're keeping living roots in that soil, where otherwise they would, under the peak times of biological activity, when those soils are warm, you're used to a crop being there with no active plant material there. Say if with repeated spraying or tillage, those microbes really don't have a lot to feed from. So that's where prevent plant gets a gain, along with all of the soil health benefits we've discussed before that cover crops bring to the table. All right, next. So we have a great resource with the Midwest Cover Crop Council, and I'm going to highlight some of the things of it. But there is a fact sheet on cover crop considerations for prevented planting, and you can find that on our website. And I have the link there. But certainly, if you go to MidwestCoverCrops.org and you go to the search bar and type in prevent plant or consider it cover crops for prevent plant, you can easily search up that fact sheet. Next. So some of the things from that, if you're going to look at species for these situations, so that would be things like our summer annuals come to mind most prevalently. We don't often get to use some of these species, which actually have a lot of potential, but because we have most of our crops are out during the summer, we don't have those opportunities. Some of the main grasses, sorghum sudan or pearl millet, those would be two very common grass species we would use in our summer mixes. Legumes, cowpeas or sun hemp. Cowpeas are actually what's pictured here in the picture to the right. So very vigorous. And so also in this case, of course, as a legume, help to provide nitrogen. Other broadleaves we commonly think of things like buckwheat and sunflower. So those are others to add into mixes. And usually I think it's in most cases nice to have a mixture in there of a couple of species, depending on what we have. Other considerations would be some of our winter grains, oats, radish, and mustards. And the reason I kind of put these as other considerations is it really does depend on your planting date. Refer to our cover crop selector tool, which Eileen hit on earlier in our drainage discussion, is that look at when some of these have optimal planting dates. Oats, for example, can be utilized throughout the time. It doesn't perform as well during some of the intense heat of the summer, but it can be used. Some of our winter grains have mixed performance due to their winter annual nature if you plant them too early, say in June. But if you get to, say, August time frame and you still need to plant something or even late July, then that opens up more opportunities for some of these things. Some of these species as winter annuals fairly early, if it was, say, May or June, are going to bolt or just not perform the same as they would in the latter half of the summer. Next. So this is just an example of some summer cover crops I've had. This was from a demonstration plot. So this is pearl millet. As you can see, the tall grass with like the cattail type heads along mixed with some cowpeas. For me, that's cowpeas. You can tell from my couple of example pictures. I think have a really great place. Them, and especially with the grass, they're a very strong weed suppressor. Once they get established, you can tell it's kind of a jungle out there. So that's just tons of lush growth, and whenever these are all winter kill, but the soil is just so mellow after that next year after a cover crop like this. Next. So there are a few considerations as far as prevent planting. So when you think of that, considering residual herbicides, especially if you have applied any spring herbicides, that could kind of dictate where you need to go with some of your cover crops and what species may or may not work. And some of that depends on how the products, and then also how long has it been and how much rainfall have you had since you've made those herbicide applications. Also consider the weed pressure in your field a little bit. If you have strong either broadleaf or grass pressure, maybe you want to stick to a broadleaf only or grass only mix, so that way you could allow the opportunity to use either a grass or broadleaf specific herbicide in that cover crop if you need to try to manage really problematic weeds in those fields. So that would be a potential thing to consider. Although I would say with good fertility and a good clean start whenever you plant your cover crops, a lot of these summer species I mentioned are extremely competitive and can usually get ahead of the weeds if they have a little moisture to get them established and a good opportunity to take off. Grazing and forage harvest is something to consider. Certainly, do want to note any forage quality, especially under really droughty conditions, due to any potential, we'd say, high levels of nitrates or anything. But also, if you're getting a payment for prevent planting, also do check into the details of when you can make any forage harvest, to not be in violation of any prevent plant claims. So also think of your next crop in your selection. So especially if the wheat is in mind, it's always, of course, wheat being a grass appreciates nitrogen. So maybe having, maybe more legume heavy, thinking about things that you could easily maybe mow down or terminate. Obviously staying away from maybe some winter annuals that could be problematic, cereal rye, other things that you don't want to have potentially intermixed in with wheat in the field. So I think that was most of what we had as far as on the prevent planting sides, and I will turn it back to Eileen to talk a little bit about compaction.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. So the last main topic for today is compaction. And I know there was a whole webinar on compaction for those of you who might have been on Wednesday. But we're basically reminding ourselves that compaction can be surface compaction and or subsurface compaction. And where might cover crops be able to help with alleviating some of those issues? So if we look at how soil physical properties in general can be improved by cover crops and then relate that to compaction type issues, cover crops, especially the grasses, can be really helpful in improving soil aggregation. And we usually think of that near the surface. So dealing with some surface compaction issues. So especially those fibrous rooted crops. Essentially, the roots are growing and enmeshing the soil particles, pulling them together, gluing them together, building and stabilizing soil aggregates. They're also exuding carbon compounds that feed the microorganisms. And then those microbes produce these glues or polysaccharides that glue the aggregates together. So these fibrous rooted crops can really help alleviate some of the surface compaction issues that we might have from beating raindrops or smearing of tires and so on. If we look more in the subsoil to improve porosity and permeability of the soil, then especially the tap-rooted crops are going to be more significantly helpful to us. By having those deep roots, they can create macropores, which then allow for water flow into the soil and better aeration and simply better root growth of the next cash crop. So we'll go into that just a little more. When the soil surface is protected by having cover crops growing, and the better aggregation that we get, then we're going to have less crusting or erosion. So again, less generation of the next surface compacted layer. And just having roots growing in the soil gives the soil strength for trafficability. You know, if you try to walk on the sod versus walk on a freshly tilled field or a freshly tilled garden, you can walk on the sod much quicker after a heavy rain than you can walking on that tilled soil. And the cover crops roots also really help with that. So this is kind of our favorite brassica right now, the daikon radish. This picture was taken the day after Thanksgiving a number of years ago. Lush radish growth. And of course, everybody gets excited about these radish tubers. And they can, in fact, help reduce some of the surface compaction, surface in this case meaning top 6 inches or so, by growing. But I actually find the taproot below the tuber to be really probably more important. So we were pulling out some of those radishes that day, and you can see this long taproot that, as my student pulled those out, came out with that particular radish. So this long taproot is what's going to help down below, right? Both in reducing compaction in the subsoil as well as making root channels for next year's corn crop and providing for water flow and aeration. So let's take a look at roots versus shoots. I know I sometimes get folks that are disappointed when they talk with me about their cover crop because they say, well, you know, I only got a couple inches of top growth and I don't know if that's doing me any good. Well, for cover crops planted in the fall, the root growth is usually much greater than the top growth. And so when we're talking about building soil health or building soil quality, a lot of times the roots are really more important than the tops. Certainly, yes, for some of the purposes that we grow cover crops, we need a reasonable amount of shoots, right? If you're going to graze it or if you want erosion protection, you do need to have some top growth, some shoot growth. But for building soil aggregation and for building permeability in the soil, really the roots are much more significant. So let's take a look at just a few examples of what root growth looks like for some different cover crops. So the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative in Indiana did a project where they took some diagrams that were painstakingly made almost a century ago by putting a clear acetate over a pit, a soil pit where these cover crops were being grown, and they traced them by hand. And so we have some excellent diagrams of some rooting structures from different cover crops. And of course, these are going to vary a little bit with different varieties of each of these cover crops, but it gives you a good idea of the general cover crop structure. So here we have the daikon radish, which we just looked at a picture of in the field. And you can see besides the tuber, we have some deep tap roots with only a little bit of branching, but you can just see how that's going to affect flow down in the field. And by the way, these are in inches, right? So this is 10 inches, 20 inches, 30 inches. So you can have growth that goes pretty darn deep with this radish. Now, have a picture of that, deep, not that much spread compared to, for example, cereal rye. And you can see a lot of fibrous roots, and certainly they go deep as well, but it's more of a fibrous root that you would expect is going to be helping that aggregation in the shallower soil. This is pretty good fibrous roots. Now take a look at the next one that we have, annual ryegrass, tremendous amount of fibrous roots. It's a turf type grass as opposed to a grain, a cereal grain. And so this would be like on your lawn if you have a good lawn. I don't have a good lawn, but if you have a good lawn, it's like the roots that you would have there, holding soil together and really building aggregation. Oats also have fibrous roots, but not as much, certainly not as much as the annual ryegrass and not as much as the cereal rye either, but they're going to do a pretty good job of aggregating the soil. So just an idea that the roots are really a substantial part of what we look for with cover crops as far as improving our soils. If you put cover crops together with no-till, you can get even more benefit. This was a photo from my colleague Tom Casper, now retired from Iowa, but just showing some of the granule soil structure and the rooting, and my favorite earthworm burrow here that comes when you have cover crops and no-till working together. Surface compaction, silage ground is one of the worst for surface compaction just from the action of raindrops and soil erosion. So this picture was taken on May 4th of that year, but you can see on the right, you've got corn silage where you've removed everything except maybe 8 inches of the corn stalk, and you've got bare ground that's been rained on all winter, crusted, eroded, nutrients have been lost, microorganisms are starving. On the left, you've got that nice cereal rye cover crop protecting the soil, recycling those nutrients, scavenging those nutrients, feeding the organisms. So again, very effective for preventing surface compaction in the first place. So what about that subsoil compaction? And we talked about cover crops and that having a tap-rooted cover crop can be very effective. What about deep ripping? And Aaron talked a little bit about that on Wednesday with the compaction webinar. But if you have severe subsoil compaction, deep-rooted cover crops can help. But again, as Nathan said earlier, they're not miracle workers. They're not miracle workers for fertility. They're not miracle workers for compaction either. So it's possible that you might need to do some subsoiling or deep ripping to alleviate that severe compaction that has been generated. But I do have to remind you all that subsoiling or deep ripping is only effective when the soil is dry. The whole way that it works is that shank goes through the soil and lifts a little bit and shatters, and the soil has to be dry in order for the soil to shatter, and that's what's actually breaking up the compaction. Just pulling a knife through butter, okay, really wet soil with clay doesn't alleviate the compaction, and in fact it makes it worse because it compacts now deeper where that wet soil is. So if the soil is good and dry in the fall, which in much of the Midwest it often is, deep ripping might be very effective. And then what you'd want to do is try to plant a cover crop and include at least one deep-rooted cover crop so that you use that opportunity. We've now kind of made the connection again. We've broken up that restriction between the topsoil and the subsoil. So get some roots to grow down in there and make that connection a little bit more permanent again. Of course, when we're working with folks about compaction, there's probably a reason it got compacted in the first place. And so if it's systematic with the system that's being used and a person has to deep rip every 2 or 3 years, then there needs to be some adaptation, some change in the management system so that you don't continue to compact year after year. So the cover crops can help along with the deep ripping. So with that, we have finished our part. So actually, I think we decided we are going to take questions first. Is that correct, Claire?
Yes, please. Yep. And we have a couple of questions in the chat, but please feel free to ask your questions. We have plenty of time to address questions here. So first are there covers that can help influence pH to maybe make more acidic conditions, for example, to improve the soil for acidic loving plants like Christmas trees or blueberries?
I'm going to pass on that one.
Thanks, Eileen.
Sure.
No, I would say on that, and I'm happy to hear any other thoughts. I don't know of any cover crops that can really dramatically influence pH. There's some that maybe that can maybe handle different pH conditions better. but I don't think there's really anything that that I'm aware of, at least substantially, that's going to do anything to amend it. I think the biggest thing is if you're in a situation, you mentioned, Christmas trees, blueberries. If you're in that situation, think about, and I mentioned annual ryegrass. There are some others that will tolerate it. That's not the only one, but certainly think about the species you're using, so they'll have the most optimal growth in those conditions and hopefully give you the best return.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, going back to Eileen's briefing, instead of installing tile, would it be better and or more cost effective to put a different cover in the poor drainage area, one that is more suitable for that environment?
So I would say that if when I'm talking about tile drainage, I'm talking about soils that are naturally poorly drained. And so probably that field would benefit from drainage for the cash crop anyway. Generally, if it's a high water table soil, it probably needs tile drainage. But certainly as an option, you could plant a cover that will do better with wet feet than others. But I don't know if the cash crop, the cash crop also suffers from having wet feet. So, yeah, not talking about fields that have been compacted and that's why they're not draining well. That's not what I mean when I say poor drainage. I mean, it's a high water table soil. So if you want to grow our typical agronomic crops, you probably are going to need drainage for them as well.
Thank you. Yep, good clarification. Are there soil conditions where cover crops are not especially helpful?
Of course not. They're helpful everywhere.
Yeah.
I think it's just all a matter of finding the right one for the right situation. So no, and I would add one quick aside to your comments, Eileen, on the poor drainage. I've worked in some southern Illinois soils that are similar to probably some of your southern Indiana ones, and yeah, I think it's about choosing your cover crops, and then I do think even in those cover crops aren't a replacement, but for some of the growers that have been in a long-term no-till and cover crop system and worked through some of the species, they have made subtle improvements. It's not the same as tiling one year and not the year before, but they're able to make soil improvements that help. You're still in a poorly drained soil, but there's certainly lots of improvements. So,
right, I think they're synergistic. So the once you've dealt with the main drainage issue, then the cover crops and the no-till are going to continue to improve the soil, and it will drain better. But if you don't have the drain tiles there in the first place, it has no place to drain to.
mm-hmm. Yep.
And yeah, going on, are there any soil conditions where cover crops are not helpful? I think, as Nathan said, it depends. Any soil, I think, can be improved. It's just different soils could use different kinds of improvement. Maybe a prairie soil in Iowa doesn't need to increase organic matter, but it could still increase aggregation. It could still increase, aeration and things like that. So the particular benefit that you're looking for will be different with different soil types.
And I didn't see any more questions come in. So I think we will wrap it up, and thank you, Eileen and Nathan, for your time and your expertise. And I thank you all for joining our series this week. Hopefully you learned lots.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.